In this section, we'll be looking at competition and conflict in Europe regarding war. To understand that, we first need to talk a little bit, though, about medieval society. So first of all, medieval society was based on distinctions. There were different groups of people, and they were organized into a hierarchy. And there's no kind of surprise there. We've seen that in other civilizations, right? For example, Indian civilization had its varnas. Here, though, the hierarchy is those who work. That would be the serfs and the peasants. That would be represented by this figure here. He's got his shovel. Those who fight. That would be the nobility. The knights, the lords, the kings. That's this guy here. And those who pray. That would be the priests, the monks, and the nuns. That's represented by these people here. Notice in this is an earlier medieval understanding, there's no those who trade. Those people are missing for now. It's going to be later on that we're going to have the development of those who trade. But I just want to note, there are merchants. They're just not important enough to receive one of these designations. Now, you can see there's going to be kind of a tension here, right? I mean, you can kind of see it here. We have those who pray, this monk here, who represents a church centered around Jesus, who chooses to die rather than to fight back, chooses to allow himself to be executed, and that emphasizes peace. And then you have a state that the church is married to that is dominated by those who fight. Right? The kings and nobles are first and foremost warriors. They're warrior kings in a sense. And that makes sense when you think about it practically. Remember, after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was this partnership between the Germanic warrior kings and the church to rebuild Europe. That makes sense. But that doesn't mean there's not a tension between a church that tries to emphasize peace, love thy neighbor, turn the other cheek, all those things, and nobility and kings that focus on war. And you can kind of think about it this way, right? The people who govern are warriors. And there's a saying, when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. Right? When your only tool in the toolbox is a hammer, all your problems look like nails. In other words, when warriors have a problem, they're going to try and solve it by fighting. It doesn't mean they don't do diplomacy and things like that, but warriors think primarily about how to fight, how to expand their realms. So we have kind of a tension here. And so there was a lot of fighting in medieval Europe. Right? There was a lot of fighting in medieval Europe. And the church condemned these warriors, saying, why are you guys fighting each other? You're supposed to love your neighbor. You're supposed to turn the other cheek. And yet the church relied on those same warriors to protect it. So there's a tension here. And this tension is closely connected to the Crusades. Now, we have to understand that the contact and conflict between Christians and Muslims was very complex. So, for example, we talked about how in the Islamic Caliphate, Christians were tolerated as long as they paid a tax, but they were not equal to Muslims. And at times, Christians in Muslim lands did suffer, as did Jewish people too. And just to give you an example, in the 11th century, early 11th century, a Muslim ruler of Jerusalem destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the church that was built above where Christians believe the tomb of Jesus is. That's a pretty big deal. And Christians had a memory of Islamic expansion, that there were territories that had been under Christian rule that were no longer under Christian rule, were under Muslim rule. And so there was kind of a desire to, get those back, especially among the Christian Byzantine Empire. And Christians did fight back, and a lot of the times they lost. We've talked about that, right? So you have this Islamic expansion into not only the Persian Empire, but into a lot of lands that had been governed by Christians. And it's important to note that Christians had lost Jerusalem, which, the place where Jesus suffered and died, and where Christians believe he came back to life again. So you could have good relations between Christians and Muslims, but there's always kind of a tension there. There's always something that's kind of complex. And the key thing is, whereas the Christians, of course, think about that territory as theirs, Muslims have been living there for so long, in control of it for so long, they think of it as theirs too. And basically, whoever is stronger, and typically it's the Muslims, tend to expand because that's what people do in this time period, right? When you're stronger, you try and expand your power, you try and go out and conquer. And when you're weaker, other people will expand against you. So you've got a situation where both sides can see each other as the threat, because the Christians don't always lose. They do occasionally win battles as well. So, like I said, it's very complex. You've got this situation where, for example, the city of Jerusalem, Christians see it as theirs. It was rightfully theirs. It had been under Christian rule. But Muslims have controlled it for so long, they think of it as theirs. And of course, the Jewish people could just say, well, we did kind of start the city. Maybe it's ours. But unfortunately for them, they don't have a lot of military powers. There's not a whole lot they can do at this point. So I just want to stress there is there's a lot of conflict between Christians and Muslims, and both feel threatened by the other, because whenever one gets the upper hand, they will expand. Now in 1095, we're going to enter a period where Muslims were becoming weaker and where Christians were becoming more unified and stronger. So it's a time for Christian expansion, right? Christians will try and take advantage of this. Now, it's not like Christians sat down and thought of it that way, exactly, but that's kind of how things happen. The way they thought of it, though, is more like this. In 1095, a pope, Urban II, will call the First Crusade. Remember, we talked a long, long time ago about Pope Leo, this 5th century pope who had managed to talk to Attila the Hun and convince him not to invade and take over Rome. And the popes remained powerful figures in Europe, right? The popes are very powerful figures in Europe. And he's going to call a crusade. He's going to say, let's go and liberate the Holy Land. Now, why does he do that? He has multiple reasons. The first is that the Byzantine emperor asked him for help. Islamic forces had been expanding recently against the Byzantine forces. And he asked for the Western Christians, asked the Pope, to help him out. This could be understood as a kind of just war, right? The Byzantine Empire is threatened. Our neighbor is being attacked, our Christian neighbor, no less, and has wrongfully had territory seized from him. That's theft and violence, so we need to intervene to help. In addition, this war isn't, though, just understood as a just war, it's also a holy war. We need to retake Jerusalem, right? We need to retake Jerusalem. This is the city where Christ suffered, where we believe he rose from the dead. We need to retake it. And also, we need to do this because Christian pilgrims need to be able to go to Jerusalem. Christians want to go and worship in the place where Jesus preached, where he died, and where we believe he was resurrected. And as long as this territory is under Muslim control, it's very difficult for us to do that. And this is true that there were Muslim raiders who kept attacking pilgrims and killed a large number of them. And the Pope also had some practical desires as well for calling this crusade. Maybe the Orthodox will accept him and accept his authority. Remember, one thing we talked about, and this is way oversimplified, but for our purposes, it's enough. I mentioned that you can kind of think about Orthodox Christians as looking a lot like Catholics, but they have more ritual and they don't have a pope. Okay, the Pope would like them to accept his authority, and maybe if he, helps them out, they will. So there's a practical concern here too. And also, here's the other thing. Christians were fighting each other in Europe, right? Christian nobles and kings were fighting each other. And the Pope didn't like that. You're supposed to love your neighbor. Why are you guys fighting each other? Especially, why are you Christians fighting each other? Well, let's give them something to do. They want to fight. Let's go have them fight in a just war, in a holy war. Let them kill non-Christians, right? Sounds really bad from our perspective, but the point of this class is not so much to judge, but to try to understand why people acted as they did, right? These warriors want to fight. Well, let them go fight someone else, far away from Europe. Now, the Pope can call a crusade and people might not listen, but Christian knights responded very, very enthusiastically to the crusade. Why? There's a lot of reasons, but one key reason is that they could do their job and still go to heaven. The Pope promised, if you die in this crusade, you're going to heaven. And the knights in Europe were kind of like, well, that's a good deal. because in their battles that they had, especially when they fought other Christians, the church was critical and was like, you could go to hell for this. You're killing other people. You're killing your neighbor, quite literally. Like, you're fighting with the Lord who lives next to you. You could go to hell for that. But now a knight's being told, hey, I can fight and can be rewarded for fighting by going to heaven. So they're going to respond positively. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, this fails. Crusading ultimately fails, at least if we measure success by whether you retake the Holy Land or not. So the First Crusade does capture Jerusalem in 1099, but it holds it for less than a century. Right? The First Crusade is the most successful crusade. It does manage to capture Jerusalem, but it loses it after less than a century. So it doesn't hold it for very long. The reason the Crusaders mostly were successful was because Muslims were divided. There was a Sunni Shia division here, especially, that was causing Muslims problems. And initially, they just didn't take the Crusaders seriously. In fact, the different Muslim groups tried to get the Christian Crusaders to help them against other Muslims. So there's a lot of Muslim disunity, and they were just surprised. Right? News traveled slowly in this time period. They just didn't realize that the Crusaders were coming. They didn't take them seriously as a threat. So success was based largely on Muslim disunity and, to a certain extent, the element of surprise. However, there's going to be numerous problems that prevent the Crusaders from holding on to their gains. First of all, it's just too far from the European heartland. Most of the Crusaders are coming from here. Central and Western Europe and England. They're coming from France, especially the Franks. In fact, the Muslim forces will generally refer to the Crusaders, it doesn't matter where they're from, as Francs. Frange, I think, is the word they use. But remember, this is a time period when they don't have advanced navies, they don't have airplanes or cars or anything like that. So the Middle East is pretty far from Germany, from England, from France, the central kind of centers of crusading. So it's just far. It's also very expensive. It costs a lot of money to maintain these kingdoms here in the Middle East, the Crusader kingdoms, and they do not make money. This area here is not a terribly wealthy place. They don't make a lot of money off this. So this actually sucks in money. Sometimes people say, oh, the Crusaders, it was just all about making money. No, they lost money, generally speaking, at least in the long term. These areas are important for strategic and religious reasons. Basically, Jerusalem is important religiously, and then the Crusaders wanted to seize this other territory in order to defend Jerusalem. But this is not a money-making area. This cost a lot of money, and it could only survive as long as people from Europe kept pumping money in. When they didn't want to or weren't able to, it's going to fall apart. And that's very important to keep in mind. And one thing I should point out, if you study the later Crusades, they talk about wanting to seize Egypt, and you may be like, why did the Crusaders want Egypt? That's really far away. It's because they needed a base, an economic base, if they wanted to hold on to Jerusalem. If they would have seized Egypt, maybe the history would have been very different. They would have kept this, but they were not able to do that. And eventually the Muslims are going to unify sufficiently to drive off the Crusaders. Right? Once they realize that the Crusaders are a threat, they're going to unify. And they, just as a side, they do it mostly under a man named Saladin, who's going to be able to push the Crusaders out. So eventually, and he's the one that actually retakes Jerusalem and puts it under Islamic rule. So I just want to stress, this shows the comparative weakness of Europe. The Europeans, working with the Byzantines, were able to make some initial conquests in the Holy Land, but didn't last. Right? Didn't last. So we can still see how Europe, even if they are good soldiers and good fighters, don't have the ability yet to really go out and take and hold foreign territory, even when they unify, right? Which they did in the Crusades to a large extent. But something else is going to be going on during this time period that's going to help drive European power, right? Something else is going to be going on during this time period that's going to help drive European power, and that's the 100 Years' War. Now, first of all, two things I need to struggle about, or to emphasize about the 100 Years' War is this. Lasted 116 years, right? Not 100 years. But also, it's not like they were constantly fighting. We just use this as a kind of shorthand to explain that there was this kind of long-term struggle between England and France. They weren't fighting every single year, but they did fight a lot of those years. And it just is easier for us conceptually to think of it this way. And one thing you'll see initially, right, England controls a lot of France. This has to do with it's very complex, but basically the royal families had intermarried and nobles had intermarried. And that led England into control of lots of France. And the English king decided he wanted to be the French king too. And this led to lots of wars. And you can kind of see how this develops, right? The key thing, though, is eventually in the end, I want to point out, England will lose. And England will become clearly England, and France will become clearly France. But there's a couple things I want to note here about war and how it's going to kind of set the stage for European power, right? In the Crusades, the Europeans aren't that powerful yet. But there's going to be developments during the 100 Years' War that show us how the kind of conflict and competition that's happening in Europe is going to set the stage for them to become more powerful. So I want to note the existence of two saints that I think kind of illustrate what's changing. The first has nothing to do with England or France, and that's St. Francis. His name maybe sounds like France, but he's not from France. He's from Italy. And St. Francis is famous for the blessing of pets. He's the patron saint of animals. Sometimes on his feast day, churches will invite people to bring their pets and have them blessed. St. Francis is known for preaching humility and other things like that. And we'll talk more about him later. For now, I just want to note that the story goes that St. Francis, when he was trying to figure out how to serve God, he went into an abandoned church and the crucifix spoke to him, right? A crucifix is a cross with Jesus on it. And there's a story that the crucifix spoke to him. And the crucifix said, "Francis, rebuild my church." And Francis thought they literally meant this church here, the physical building. But then he later came to realize, oh, it means I'm supposed to reform the church. Right? I'm supposed to reform the church. And we'll talk more about Francis later, but I want to stress, he believes he receives a vision from God. He believes this crucifix talks to him and tells him to rebuild the church. You probably heard of St. Francis. You probably have also heard of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was a peasant girl who believed she had visions in which she spoke to angels and saints. And she believed that God had called her to fight the English and drive them out of France. And here's a quote from her that I think really highlights this. Of the love or hatred God has for the English, I know nothing, but I do know that they will all be thrown out of France except those who die there. Right? I mean, all the English are going to either be dead or out of France. So she really wants to drive the English out of France. So what we see here developing in Europe, I think, is a kind of greater national identity. Francis believes he has a vision, and it's a vision of God telling him to serve the church. Joan also has a vision, or believes she has a vision, I should say, but in her vision, she believes God is calling her to serve France and drive out the English. So they both believe in God, they're both Catholics, but notice that Francis is identifying his Catholic identity as first and foremost, whereas Joan is emphasizing her national identity. So my key point here, as we can see in the 100 Years' War, is there's a growing sense in Europe of national identity, where people, even a peasant, Joan of Arc was a peasant girl. Peasants usually didn't care who ruled them. At least they didn't care who their kings were. They maybe cared about who their lord was, but not out of any great loyalty, but their hope that the Lord would be nice to them. But Joan, a peasant girl, is saying, you know, English should not be ruling France. The French should rule France. Right? We should have a French king, not an English king. So you see in the 100 Years' War, in which Joan of Arc plays an important role, when the French are losing, she helps kind of reverse things and helps push out the English to a certain extent. You can see this rise of national identity. So that's the first thing I want you to get out of the 100 Years' Wars. We see a rise in national feelings, national identity among Europeans, which will lead them to be in competition with each other, which will help drive them out to explore. The other thing I want to emphasize is how the constant conflict and battles in Europe are teaching them to develop better weapons. So, for example, this is an early battle, the Battle of Cressy, in which the English defeat the French. Why did they defeat the French in this battle? They just slaughter the French. The French archers are armed with crossbows, which are great, but they're not as good as longbows. Trained longbowmen can fire many more arrows than a crossbowman can fire from a greater range. And so what happened is when the French knights charged, the English longbowmen just filled them full of arrows and they all died. Like they killed, I believe, several thousand French knights in a very short period of time. Now, the English also used cannon. I believe these were called bombards in this battle, but they didn't do much. The cannon were unimportant. What was important were the bows. And this was an English victory. Now I want to make a contrast here, right? This is the Battle of Cressy during the 100 Years' War. Bows are what's important. There's cannon, but they're not very good. They don't really play a major role. The final major battle of the war, which the French win, which is why they get to stay independent, have an English king, is the Battle of Castilian. This is a very different battle. It's kind of like Cressy in reverse because it's the English who are going to charge and get slaughtered. But I want this image emphasizes a couple important things. Look at that cannon. That's quite a bit more advanced, isn't it? Right? This thing is just, it's going to be kind of hard to deal with. It's hard to move around. It's hard to load. It's not going to be terribly accurate. This, though, looks a lot more like a modern cannon. It's going to be a lot more accurate. It's going to be a lot more powerful. And they've developed guns to the extent that, notice, this guy has a primitive matchlock. Now you notice it takes two men to operate it. This guy here is lighting it. This guy here is holding it. But it won't be too long before Europeans are going to develop really good handheld ones that only one person needs to use. So my point here is to use the 100 Years' War, and this is the second point, to show how Europeans, because they're in constant conflict, they're fighting, they're developing better military weapons, and they're learning how to use them very well. Right? In the same war, granted it was a war that lasted over 100 years, we had them going from the bow being the king of the battlefield, and with very simple cannon, to much more advanced gunpowder weapons, with these gunpowder weapons going from being unimportant to decisively important. Right? The key reason the French won this battle was they tricked the British or the English into attacking where they had massed their artillery and just blew them to bits with that artillery. So Europeans are developing really advanced military techniques. We can see that very clearly here. And they use those techniques to help them launch a crusade that works. If you understand the Crusades as trying to recover Jerusalem, yeah, they failed. But at the same time, there was another crusade, the Reconquista, that was going on, which was not aimed at recovering the Holy Land, but was aimed at recovering the Iberian Peninsula. Remember, we talked about how the Islamic Caliphate expanded and had actually conquered most of Spain. Not all, this part remained under Christian control. Had controlled much of Spain and threatened France, but Charles Martel defeated them, and they had to back off. Well, from 1085 to 1492, we have what's called the Reconquista. Notice that's about the same time. It begins about the same time as the Crusades. That's why there weren't many people coming from this area to fight in the Crusades. They were down here fighting the Crusade. And here, with their advanced military techniques, Christian armies are able to reconquer Spain and bring it under Christian rule. And this is ultimately successful in the year 1492. Well, isn't that funny? That's also the same year that Columbus is going to sail for the Americas. And that is not a coincidence. So this is key for us to understand. The ability of the Europeans are in conflict with each other. They're fighting with each other. They get better at fighting. So while they lose the Crusades to the Holy Land, they're going to keep fighting with each other, and that spurs them on to develop the military might and know-how to win this crusade, the reconquest of Spain, and then, of course, Portugal. And that, in turn, gives them the base from which they're able to launch the voyages of exploration, particularly that of Christopher Columbus. We'll talk more about that, though, later, but I just wanted to see how we can see how the foundations being laid for European exploration and later European power.